live. This is going to be, I think, a fantastic seminar. We've assembled our almost entire team, editorial team, and it's just, it's so funny when we talked this morning. I just realized we don't get a chance to talk amongst ourselves all that much. So we're going to take your questions for the next hour or so. And if you enjoy it, great. If it's a disaster, it's all Neil's fault because it was his idea.
Always my fault.
But so please give us your questions so we can weave them in and not, have them all come at the last minute. But so we've got everybody here. Eric Guido's the latest addition to our team. Neil, of course, everyone knows. Josh Reynolds has been going to the Rhone for longer than anybody that is active, and same thing is true of Steve Tanzer. So quite the assembled group. It's such a privilege to work with everybody. But so thanks everyone for dialing in. Thanks guys for being here. This is going to be a great deal of fun. And as we wait for questions to come in, I guess maybe I'll throw it out. One of the things that's amazing is just how much the world of wine has changed. And Steve, you've been going to Burgundy since like the mid 80s. So what's it like? What was it like then versus what's it like now?
I thought you mentioned how the world of wine has changed in the last 6 weeks, but yes, in the last 35 years, I think I was in Burgundy for the first visit in 1988. I was there to taste 87 reds from barrel and 86s from bottle. And obviously back then there were many, many fewer estates on my list to visit. In fact, back then my initial trips to Europe, whether it was to Burgundy or to the Rhone Valley or to Alsace, I could fly on a Saturday night, land on Sunday, taste Monday through Saturday, be home on Sunday. But then everywhere, the list of good estates and revived estates began to grow, and the trips stretched into the next week and then 2 full weeks. I mean, this happened in the Piedmont as well. This happened in Napa Valley. But back then, Burgundy was pretty quiet. There were very few cellars closed to the public back then. It was very easy to get appointments. In recent years, when you're trying to put together a schedule that makes sense geographically, so you don't do a lot of extra driving, very difficult because the demand on winemakers' time is extraordinary. Not just from wine journalists, of course, but consumers as well. I think of people like, today I think of people like Christophe Roumier and Eric Rousseau, estates like that. I have no idea how they handle the number of requests they get each year. I mean, they don't have a glass of wine to sell to the next visitor. I think they should be sainted for seeing anybody. It's totally changed today.
Josh, what about the Rhone?
Pretty much the same situation that Steve is talking about. My first visit to the Rhone to visit cellars was in July of 1989. And back then, I mean, fax was fairly new even for us, for me. And most of these folks did not have it at all. And even trying to find their phone numbers was difficult. Obviously, had to work with importers who would put you in contact. Hopefully they would answer their phone. Back then, the telephones were about the size of our laptops now. And most of these producers were working in the vineyards. As far as a tasting room goes, nobody had any kind of a tasting room to welcome the public, including big people. Back then, even people, you went in the door, you met usually, as we talked earlier this morning, sometimes 3 generations would be there to welcome you because they were thrilled to have an American there who had actually knew about their wines, knew some history about what was going on. And fast forward over the years, and it's exactly the same situation that Steve is talking about here. Trying to set up appointments to see these people can be a challenge, even a nightmare, because they're traveling. They have so much pressure on them, demands, and the domains haven't really, in many cases, grown that much. So it's just this exponential attention that they've been getting, even though their production in many cases really hasn't changed a lot. of Rostang, for example, who over the years since I started going there inherited vineyards from his uncles, Villiers and obviously Gentas. So, but even then, you're only talking about expanding few hectares. But now they're getting requests and demands for visits from all over the world, and they're generally very outgoing people. They don't like to say no. It's just kind of not in their DNA, and so they kind of drive themselves crazy trying to keep up with it. Obviously, pricing.
I think Josh and I like the small scale of production best. The regions we go to, I'm thinking of the Rhone Valley or Burgundy or Piemonte, as opposed to, say, Bordeaux and Tuscany, where you're much less likely, in Burgundy and the Rhone, you're visiting face to face with the owner at their house, petting their dog. I really
We're getting bit by their dog.
Winemakers as a race of people, and there's just no substitute for that direct contact.
Well, no, I just recently got back from the Northern Rhone, and still to this day, I can't tell how many visits. It's you pull into the courtyard or you pull up in front of the winery, and the door opens, and down the stairs comes the often husband, wife, grandfather, to bring in the cellar, and that part hasn't changed, which I love. And that's one of the things I love so much about actually getting there and spending time with them. You gather so much, almost like hard to quantify. You absorb so much more information, I think, unspoken when you're with them face to face, and you gain so much more perspective, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. I think we're all pretty fortunate that we get to make a living in non-pandemic times, traveling to these places, certainly tasting a lot of wine. I'm curious, Neil, was there a wine that really sort of set you on the path of writing about wine, or how did you sort of make the transition into this field?
Well, I mean, I sort of grew up, my family didn't drink wine so much, hardly ever, just a bottle of Black Tower or Peace Porter for Sunday lunch. I can remember that, or Mateus Rosé. So I didn't really drink wine until I was 25, something like that. So I had no background in wine. So and then I sort of happened to get the job in wine, and then I sort of discovered it. I usually say for me it was a bottle of Monroe's 82, which made me understand why it was more than just a beverage. That was the first wine I sort of got, oh, that's why people are a little bit crazy about this stuff. And then in terms of writing about wine, I mean, that came a little bit later. And I just I'd never written before, and I just started a website like you did. And then I enjoy writing and I enjoy English. So just put the two together, wine and writing, and that's it really. So, but Monroe's 82 was the first wine. It's not the best wine, it's not the best Monroe's, but it was the first bottle that made me think differently about wine.
What about you, Eric? Was there a particular wine that really sort of got the light bulb to go off?
I would say that for me, it was when I first tasted my first mature Barolo, one that, it's funny, so I was at the time working in a restaurant, and I had a little bit of extra second income because of it. I had a day job, and I started, trying to get into wine. And a retailer sent me home with a bottle of 89 Borgogno Barolo, and I literally shook this bottle up on the way home. I, probably just popped the cork, started pouring glasses around the table, and I sat there that night and I just didn't get it. And so I called them the next day and I was like, yeah, I don't really get this. And they're like, wait, come back. They're like, get another one. It's on us. This is how we want you to treat it. Stand it up for a couple of days, open it up a few hours before you're going to pour it, decant it off the sediment and see what you think. And that was that aha moment for me, when suddenly it was like, oh my, this is what a mature bottle of Barolo tastes like. And from there, it was just, here we are.
That's down the rabbit hole, right?
Absolutely.
Especially with Piedmont wines. Well, we talked a little bit before about how fantastic it is to have the opportunity to go and visit the producers and to have that exchange and that dialogue, and how enriching it is to writing about the wines. So I'm curious, why don't we start with you, Steve? Is there a visit that really stands out for having been particularly special over all these years? Something that was just transcendental?
I think I'd have to name a visit to Alois Kracher in the genius maker of late harvest wines from the eastern shores of Lake Neusiedler in Burgenland in Austria, who tragically died of cancer at the age of 48. His son is now making the wines. I think my trip was maybe in 1986. I had already reviewed his wines, given him very high scores in print from samples tasted in New York. And I just spent a week in the Wachau tasting and then a few days of R&R with my wife in Vienna. And then we drove down on a very warm day. I remember a warm, humid day in the end of May. Drove down to the Burgenland, and we might have taken a couple of wrong turns and eventually showed up at his place about a half an hour late, which is kind of unusual for me. And Crocker greeted us, and I apologized for being late. And he looked at me like I was out of my mind. He said, "Don't worry about the half hour. I've been waiting for you all my life." And then we had this incredible visit. By the way, to this day, Crocker is one of only 2 winemakers in my professional life out of thousands who pulled samples from barrels and asked me to identify them. He did it, I got to say, he did it in a totally playful way, and I guess I passed muster. The only other time this happened was also in the late 80s with at my first and only visit with Jackie Confront, who was notorious in Von Romane, who was notoriously hostile to visiting critics. He didn't really know what to do with them. He would pour sample after sample, and pretty much I had to guess what was in the barrels. I'm not even sure he told me. I should say that his son, Yves, who I've been visiting for the last 15 years, is a much more civilized character.
I'm glad that's never happened to me. I'm sure I would fail miserably. Neil, what about you? Is there a visit that really stands
defeats the
out?
purpose. I mean, yeah.
Memorable visit. I think maybe the first time I went to La Fleur, because I'd always wanted to go there, and it was very, very early on in my career. And then I remember I was talking to Denny Durantou from L'Église Clinée, and I said to Denny, "Oh, I've always wanted to go to La Fleur. I love the wine. I've never been there. It's quite difficult to get a visit. I wasn't known then." And then he said, "Right, that's it." And he just literally phoned up Jacques Guinador and said, "Jacques, we're coming up here. I've got somebody who needs to taste your wine." Went straight up to La Fleur and saw Jacques with Denny. And I remember Baptiste then was quite young. Baptiste looked as if he'd come in from a skateboard park and had all this long hair, which he still has now. And then Jacques said, "Oh, let's do a vertical." So he pulled out all these vintages of, not really old, vintages of La Fleur. And that's definitely one that stuck in my mind, and probably one of the things that made me eventually write the Pomerol book. And
of course, both of these characters live in a house right in the middle of their vines, which is so unusual for Bordeaux.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Josh, do you have a story that?
Oh yeah. It was the first cellar that I visited in Burgundy in June of '89, and it's a domain that's gone now. Steve will obviously remember Potier Riusset, who made wines in Volnay and Pommard, and he also made a Meursault. And this was very rustic. We tasted out of test vins. He didn't have glasses. And I've never tasted out of one before, so needless to say, an awful lot of wine wound up going down my face until I got the hang of it. But we tasted through all his Volnays and his Pommards, and he said, "That's it. Thank you. I'll open up some older wines," which was a big thing then and still is now with a number of producers. and they especially like to show you off vintages or vintages they think that people got wrong. So I think he cracked out some 77, 73, questionable things, and basically made all the moves about it's time to go. And I said, we didn't taste your Merceau. And he said, oh, you don't want to taste that. And it was one I happen to like. And I said, why not? And he said, oh, it's horrible. I just really make it, for us to drink, because I don't want to buy other people's wine. I don't want to spend money on white wine when I can have my own. And I said, well, I don't get it. I mean, I kind of like the wine. He said, look, this is your first trip to Burgundy. And one of the things you're going to learn as you go up and down is that you're far better off getting a red wine made by a white wine producer than the other way around. He said, I know how to make red wine. It's tannins, it's brutal, you crush everything. He says, white wine is delicate. I don't know how to be delicate. So always remember that when you're in a cellar. And I still think of that to this day. When I see certain wines and I taste a red wine, and I say, there's something really maybe a little delicate or precise about this wine. I think, this guy probably makes really, really nice white wine. And the other way around, I think things have gotten a lot more modernized, but definitely for the first decade or so that I was doing this, it was true. It was absolutely true. And just quick stop with Burgundy, a classic example is at Ramonet, whose red wines don't get a lot of attention from a lot of places, but the red wines at Ramonet are absolutely gorgeous. And they are clearly white wine specialists. I think it's a great example. And I'd say another example would be Costa Rica.
Yeah.
If you look at the wines there, which are absolutely crystalline and pure, and they just have a certain touch. Maybe in the restaurant business, Eric would speak to this. It's kind of like I would rather have my hotline food cooked by a pastry cook than the hotline guy taking over the pastry station. It's a different discipline. But I always think of Potier Virgil, and that really kind of changed my mind about how I looked at definitely how I looked at Burgundy, but how I look at winemakers around the world.
For 30, more than 30 years, I would do my red wine trip in the fall and my white wine trip in the spring for a lot of reasons that made sense. I did one color at a time. And there really, it was, even at the end, there was only 2 handfuls of producers that I saw twice a year. Most of them large negociants like Jadot or Favely, and then some of the small up and coming negociants, but very few small domains were at the pinnacle and made important reds and important whites well.
What about you, Eric?
Point, I'm sorry, Antonio, to Josh's point, I will say that while in a restaurant, the favorite person to have cook for me would often actually be the dishwasher or the guy that mans the grill that never went to culinary school and learned in his mother's kitchen.
Memorable visit for you, Eric?
Probably, more. This is more Josh's domain, but my most memorable visit was visiting with Comando Hay, Daniel Landi, and Fernando Garcia in the Gredos Mountains. Basically, the entire day was spent hiking through these high elevation vineyards, jumping down into these ditches that they were digging to expose different layers of terroir and to talk about, how the soils had changed over time and such. And, there we are now. It's easily been a 10-hour day of hiking and exploring and such. When we sit down to dinner and Daniel basically explains that each person at the table will have a chance to go into his cellar to pull any bottle they like, as long as it's not a Comando Hay or Daniel Landi bottle, any bottle they like, wrapped in foil, and bring it up for the whole crew to basically taste through blind and try to guess what it was. And we're talking an amazing cellar that literally when I went down there were bottles that I would have pulled, but I just felt bad pulling these bottles to open them, But the thing that was really amazing to me, beyond the generosity and the skills that I witnessed at that table that night, granted, all this was being done while blasting classic rock and Daniel singing to half of the songs that came across. Daniel ended up being able to guess nearly every single wine that was brought up from that cellar on that night. with no problem. It was absolutely amazing, the skill sets that are involved in some of these that some of these winemakers possess. Definitely my most memorable visit. I think that night ended somewhere around 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning after that 10-hour day.
Wow, cool. Well, mine would probably be, since we have this incredible team, it makes me think about the early days of Vinous. And I remember this one tasting that I had at DRC, which was not necessarily extraordinary. I mean, it was just the tasting of the wines in barrel, but I mean, meaning it was the normal tasting. But it was, I think, unique because now there, as getting to what Steve said before, these domains have so much attention on them, and almost always now they try to group people together because I'm sure there's no other way to get through the work of actual making wine otherwise. But back in, this was only about 6 or 7 years ago, a lot of times you would just have a tasting with just Aubert by himself. And what I remember is when we got to the Romane Conti at the end, which is, people know if you've been there or you've read about it, you're not supposed to spit that wine. So not that, anyway, that's kind of the thing. That's sort of the unwritten rule. You're not supposed to spit the Romane Conti. So we get to to the end of the tasting. And in the meantime, Aubert's asking me all these questions about Vinous and why didn't I use my name for it, and all these other things that were very business and strategy related, which I'd never talked to him about. And then he gets out his pipette and he fills my glass with RC, like really full. And I'm like, damn, what am I gonna do? And I'm like, what I would do when I taste the wine from a barrel, we'll get to this question because somebody asked it, but I'll write my note, I'll taste the wine, I'll write my note, and then I'll taste the wine again and look at the note and say, okay, that makes sense, and then move on. So I did that, and there's all this wine left, and I'm like, I go to, to give it to him, and he goes, no, drink it. He goes, it's good for your health. This was like a morning appointment. So it was like 9:30 in the morning. I'd get there like 8:30. So it took around 9:30, 10. He's like, no, drink it. It's for you. It's good for your health. And I'm like, okay, fine. All I could do is sit there and think, I'll never taste like this much Romane Conti ever again in my life in like one slurp. But I downed it. And that was my most favorable. That was one of my most memorable visits. But we have a really good question here, which is, it's just about tasting procedures and stuff. But one of the things that I get asked a lot, and I'm sure you guys do too, and I think it would be really interesting to hear, is how do you manage the whole sort of, dealing with palate fatigue and tasting a lot of wine in a relatively short period of time and still, feel crisp and mentally engaged? I mean, what are the secrets, especially, because we have a sort of a parallel question, which is about advice for young critics or people just starting out. So this is kind of two questions in one. But Neil, like, for example, you go to Bordeaux, you go to Burgundy, it's an enormous number of appointments, or you do a consultant tasting, could be well over 100 wines. How do you deal with palate fatigue?
I think the best comparison is, I'm not an athlete, but I try and think like an athlete. And I think it's partly to do with experience, because you learn the way to make it easier for yourself. So each time you go back to, whether it's Bordeaux, Burgundy, or wherever, each time you go back, you get to learn how to sort of pace yourself through the day and what you can do and what you can't do. So I think that's one thing. I sort of find it easier now than I did 15 years ago. And I think you have to be really strict. You have to be almost like a sort of robot, so that you know that if you say I have 100 wines to taste, then, for example, I know the pace I have to taste at. I know I taste slightly quicker in the morning than the afternoon. Maybe I get a little bit tired in the afternoon, so I'll taste a little bit more in the morning. I'll make sure, right, I need to be up to wine, let's say 60, 65, something like that, and then slow down in the afternoon. And you just sort of learn that over time, so that you don't have palate fatigue. The hardest thing is not actually tasting, it's all the other stuff you have to do, like driving around. For me, translating French in my head, because my French is rubbish. So that's what actually tires me out, and typing all the notes as well, because you sort of sometimes you're balancing a laptop on top of an old barrel, and half the job is trying to make sure that your laptop doesn't fall to the ground. But yeah, think a bit like an athlete really, and learn what you can do and what you can't. What you can't do, I think, is just as important, and just to accept I can taste this many number of wines in a day, and don't push it further. It's not a test of your endurance.
Yeah, I have to say I'm immensely jealous of you, Neil, because you have the ability to taste a lot of wine and write your notes on a computer and turn around your articles like faster than anybody I've ever seen. And I hate you for that.
Yeah, I did say to someone, what do you need to be able to be a wine critic? And I always say, touch typing at speed saves you days and days. Like when I do the Burgundy report, which is going to be up to 2,000 notes, all those 2,000 notes are written by the time I finish the last visit. So I don't have to go back and then, translate 2,000 notes. I would go crazy if I had to do that.
Yeah, see, I'm still paying the price for skipping school and playing music instead of going to typing class, because that's what they taught when I was in high school.
Imagine for me doing 2/3 of my wine tasting career with little squiggles in a notebook, and then having to transcribe. I mean, you're fast, Antonio. I used to come home with the notebooks from Burgundy from tasting, let's say 100 wines a day. And I would probably spend a day and a half writing up the notes for every day I spent tasting. And that's not the fun part.
Yeah.
That's the eye strain and the back strain and the 12-hour days and 7-day weeks. But I mean, I agree with Neil. As to the tasting itself, it's like a muscle. You develop a muscle over time. It's like running a marathon. I remember 2-week trips to Burgundy. Sometimes I would have a dip in the middle, and then I'd kind of be coming strong at the end. The trip would end, and I was ready to go on for a couple more days at that point.
Wow. Josh, palate fatigue, any tricks?
Experience, getting the hang of it. I like to start as early as possible in the morning. I learned this very, very early on. I actually worked for a while at a small domain in Chassagne-Marche doing grunt work. This was in '89 and '90. And we started the day at 4 o'clock in the morning, because that was when you would, you rise at 4, you were basically staying right there. That was when you get things set up in the cellar, getting things like, tractors ready to roll, whatnot. So, as you drove through the village, you noticed that in all the cellars, the lights were on, starting anywhere from about 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning. So early on, I started asking producers, said, look, when can I come see you? How early? Early, just don't be shy. Don't be shy. And I've gotten to the point where now there are a number of people that I see at 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, 7, and there's nothing going on. There's no phones ringing. There are no cars pulling up. There's no staff running around, and it makes things move along very, very quickly. I find that the winemakers are very awake, very alert. They're not distracted. And so you get a lot of work done really fast. So I try to, a bit like what Neil was saying, I try to get as much done as possible by noon. But the good thing is, so by noon, I could have anywhere from 4 to even 7 hours under my belt. And then the afternoon, I try to dedicate to producers who maybe move a little more slowly, where either they like to talk a lot, or they have an awful lot of wines. So I try to make the afternoons be not quite as rapid. And over the years, really developed a pattern of appointments where I know who likes to be there early. Stefan Montez likes to be super early, for example, who's in Saint-Michel-sur-Rhône, Northern Rhône. Some of the people in Beaujolais like to be super early, again, before sunrise. And then some people really prefer the afternoon. So you kind of learn to pace it with them and plan your schedule accordingly. The things that kill me are the long sit downs where you might taste 100 wines over the course of a day with a short break for lunch or just to get up and walk around to get some air. And that kind of monotony, I think, drags it down. You start to feel like your notes are repetitive, especially when you're tasting young wines that don't have a lot of complexity, and you find yourself trying to describe red fruit or dark fruit over and over and over. And I think that actually makes you lose your focus because you're focusing on the distraction more than on the subject. So I think it's just a pacing, knowing who can be fast, who's going to be slow. Just really quick before I keep rambling. One of the things that does throw me off is that every year, especially when you're tasting barrels, everybody has a new one. I mean, there's a new vineyard. And so over the years, an appointment that was, say, 1 hour has turned into an hour and a half. Why? Because, I mean, for example, at Jamais in Côte-Rôtie, in the past, first time I went there was 89. There was one wine, it was Côte-Rôtie. That's it. Then later he brought on the Côte Brune. Then there's the Côte d'Aron. Then there's the Côte d'Aron Blanc. Then there's a Syrah. Now there's another Syrah. And now his son's on board, and there's a Condrieu. So it went from one wine to almost 8. And that totally changes the visit dynamic.
I always put my biggest visit at the end of the day, because at least for that one visit, I didn't have to worry about showing up, being late the rest of the day. For every other visit, I would, I'd go to Jadot at 5 o'clock. I remember one year I was in Alsace and I scheduled an appointment with Olivier Humbrecht at 4:30 in the afternoon, my third visit of that day. And he had 80 wines to show me from 2 vintages. We had dinner plans for, 8:30. Forget that. I was there tasting until I think 10:30.
Well, you could spend 4 to 5 hours tasting at Jadot. That's for certain.
Oh, easily, yeah. And that's with one color. That's twice a year.
Eric, any tips for avoiding palate fatigue?
I would say that I really kind of came to my method only about 3 years ago or so, when I realized that I was able to taste a lot more, a lot better, if I didn't have any kind of snacking or water, no crackers, no cheese. Everybody goes into tastings with this perspective from what they see of, you go to the cheese table and you snack in between and you do this. I came to realize that if I just go in well hydrated in the morning, so I don't get necessarily thirsty, I like to start early, like most of you guys have mentioned. I go in with a clean palate. I work through the wines that I have. I try not to snack. I try not to, start drinking water in between. Then I have a nice long palate cleansing lunch, which is usually a salad and usually with a very spicy dressing so I can actually taste it. Then I get myself a break where I can get a good amount of water back in me, and then go on to my afternoon. I think one of the funniest things going on, some of the stories you guys have told about your traveling in different regions and such, is how we will go to a region, we will start tasting at 7 a.m., we will stop tasting at 7 p.m., 8 p.m., if you go to Jadot, possibly 11 p.m. And that is always when it seems like the best wine of the day comes out for everybody to actually drink, after we have spent the entire day sipping and spitting wine over and over and over again. But yeah, for me, it's been the snacking, cutting it out, and a really good lunch that cleanses the palate in between the next bench work.
I remember just what Eric was saying. I remember there was one trip I did, I think it might have been Spain, where the consortio asked me what would you like to eat at lunch, and like Eric said, I said, oh, just something like a ham sandwich, something like that. I had 2 weeks of ham sandwich every single day, to the point where at the end I said, can you just give me something, anything but a ham sandwich? I was getting sick of it. So be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, that's cool. I know I like to start early, not as early as 7, but I do like to start early. I've learned over the years that I like to take a nice break in the middle of the day, not necessarily to eat a big lunch, for sure not, but just a break, maybe do some email or whatever, and just sort of decompress for a little bit. No spicy foods, no sugar, no coffee in the middle of the day, and just very plain food. And then I like to taste late into the afternoon. And my favorite time to taste, like you, Steve, is at the end of the day, 6, 7 o'clock at night. And it's interesting that culturally, like a lot of people in Italy, that's when they want you to go. Like Conterno, my tasting there is always at 7 o'clock, 6, 7 o'clock. Gaia, same thing. And the reason for that, I think, is not because there's anything to do after, because I don't do dinners anywhere, but it's because people, it's the opposite of Josh's thing. It's people don't have anything to do. You're the last appointment, the office is closed, the phone isn't ringing. People feel like they can really dedicate they're completely calm. And so a lot of the tastings that I do, especially some of the bigger ones, maybe at Vietti, where it's multiple vintages, are usually towards the end of the day, or maybe on a weekend when things are a little bit calmer. But it's funny, one time I asked a very famous California producer if I could come at 6 o'clock, and they were offended. They're like, we're not important enough to be tasted at 10 a.m. And so it's really interesting that the perception of like what is considered like a good slot, there may be some cultural sort of biases there. And I was like, no, I want to come at 6 because that way I'm not like, you make a lot of wines and I don't, there's no pressure of anything after. And I'm like, Steve, I'm not worried about being late anywhere. And they were very offended. So it was kind of funny. It was a good learning.
Most winemakers probably think that the tasters are sharpest late morning, the appointment before lunch. I mean, maybe not Spain because I haven't gotten up yet, but and the last visit they would like to see you is right after lunch. That's just psychologically, maybe because they don't want to be rushed back from their lunch, but they figure you might have a little post-meal dip and that you're not quite as sharp as you are in late morning. But I'm like Antonio. I mean, I'm not a morning person. I'm more of a night person. So I think I taste better late afternoon.
Yeah, well, Eric also says that the best wine comes out at the end of the day. That may be possible too, but I think I'm tasting at my best around 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, because you're just really focused. You've tasted a lot of wines. You're super dialed in, and for me, it's a great time to taste always. But it's obviously
when I taste in my dining room, as I've done, like 24 wines or whatever I've done over the last 30 years, I usually taste at about 7 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah. So why don't we have a ton of questions? Why don't we get to a few of them, as many as we can? This is a really good one from Richard, which is that wine review. He says wine reviews usually have a drinking window. So how do we come up with those? Are we using historic data? And how do we assign drinking windows to wines? Steve, you want to answer that?
Well, I never did it until I joined Vinous. And kicking and screaming, I've been doing it since then. And I think it's based on, in my case, it's based on having seen most of the categories of wine that I cover, having followed those categories for 30 plus years. So it is based on experience. It is based on comparative tastings. It's based on what I hear from winemakers. It's based on technical information. And, it also makes some assumptions about cellar conditions in people's homes, which is iffy. I mean, obviously I have my wines in a 55-degree warehouse and I know where they've been and I bought them carefully from the start. But I think I would have to be conservative about projecting peak drinking planes, because how many people have perfect storage? Antonio, I was just working on, as you know, I've been tasting 2010 California Cabernets, which is a brilliant vintage. It happens to be a vintage that wasn't particularly austere at the beginning. So I was looking at some of your projected drinking ranges when you tasted them after bottling. But they were, they were very conservative. A lot of them back then was started in 2015, 2018. 10 years later, a lot of those wines haven't budged. They're not austere. They're still fun to drink. They can be drunk. But I mean, my ranges are more like, it'll be even better in 2 years and it'll drink till 2040.
Yeah,
I think,
that's a very unique vintage, but yeah, for sure. I always love that.
But I would much rather underrate a wine's aging potential. It would be a nightmare if people, based on my advice, cellared wines for a long time, too late, took them out and they thought, gee, wouldn't that have been better 5 years ago or 2 years ago?
Well, it's also really objective. I mean, it's really personal. Some people like wines with more young fruit. Some people like wines with more complexity that develops in bottle. And so I think we do our best to kind of give a guideline, but it is a guideline. And that's one of those things that as each one of us, we sort of learn for ourselves. Like I prefer, we had Cleo Pallmeyer on here a couple of days ago, and she's like, I like California Chardonnay young. And she sort of said, she intimated that she liked the mature notes of Chardonnay more in French wines as opposed to in American wines. But those are the things that each one of us kind of discovers as we go on our own personal journey, and I think it's pretty cool.
Well, I like the range of aromas. I like to see a wine open in my glass. For all these years of vertical tastings that I've been doing in California, if I had the choice, I would want these wines essentially to be, except for the very young ones, to be poured before I taste them flight by flight. I don't want a 20-year-old wine that's been in a decanter for hours, because I think, first of all, they tend to be duller. You lose the first aromatics. If you pour them fresh, obviously, hopefully separated from a sediment, you get to see the wine evolve in the glass, even for the half hour it's in front of you.
Yeah. There's a question from Thomas that I think, Neil, I'd love to hear your views, which is, he says many people champion blind tasting for obvious reasons. When you review a wine, do you prefer it blind, or instead you prefer knowing the producer, vineyard, etc.? Of course, this is my comment. Now, that really depends on the region. If you're in Burgundy, you're tasting every wine with the producer, so you know it's obviously unblind. But one of the things you do that very few people do in the world is you taste wines blind and not blind, especially in Bordeaux and Burgundy. So what are the insights that you derive from that exercise? Because I think you're maybe the only person who tastes as much in both ways.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think blind tasting is as much a test of the taster as a test of the wine, and it's sort of testing you. You know, did you get that right when you tasted it from barrel? Because you don't know what it is, you know. And so I'm a big fan of not so much complete blind tasting, but you know what they call single blind tastings. So wines grouped in peers, and so tasting like for like, and it's a fantastic way to you know, really see who is sort of really delivering in bottle. And it's the one occasion where, you know, a proper blind tasting must make you look a complete idiot at some point. There has to be one wine where you think, oh my God, I've just given that 100 points and I gave it, you know. And the person that always does that is Michel Rolland. I don't know if it's happened to you, Antonio, or Steve, but you go for lunch with Michel. Michel will always pour you something you've given a really terrible score for and say, what do you think of that? And of course, you're always polite, and even if you think it's not so good, you'll say, oh, Michel, it's very, very nice. He said, well, you gave it 81 or something like that. But I for me, it's an important part of tasting, and especially when you go to Burgundy, to blind taste Burgundy, which is very difficult to do because the wines are so rare. But then you factor in, you know, the terroir and the specific vineyard. So you group all your Meursault Genévrier together, your Perriers, or your, you know, Chassagne-la-Romanée. Then that becomes very interesting because everything else is kind of the only difference. You've got the same grape varieties, the same terroir, and you're just getting the slight nuances between, say, the soil type and the orientation and the winemaker technique, you know, whether you use stems or not. So, you know, when you do something like, say, tasting the 5 Clos Saint-Jacques, Gevrey Clos Saint-Jacques together, you can put the glasses, even before tasting, you can tell, right, that one has got to be Esmenin because of the color, you can tell. And so it's a fascinating exercise to do. So I love doing it.
That's, well, when I see your articles, I'm deeply envious of all those fantastic wines, and certainly, especially in Burgundy, tasting wines blind like that. I mean, having the chance to taste, as you said, maybe a flight of Meursault Genévrier or Perrier or whatever. I mean, that is just really, really rare. There's a question here from Exotic Wine Travel that I think is pretty interesting. I'll answer because it's quick, but it's basically about calibration of scores. Do you try to calibrate scores? Stephen is tougher and usually scores on the lower side. So how do you juggle all the opinions under one brand? And the answer to that is very simple, which is everybody writes their own articles, and we're really firm believers in exalting the voice of each individual person on our team. And so people write the articles and call the wines the way that they see them. Even Neil and I, who overlap on Bordeaux, I mean, I don't ever see any of his work until it's literally the minute before it gets published. So I have no idea what he thinks about any wine. And in fact, even if we're in Bordeaux at the same time, if we're lucky, we might have one dinner together. The last time in December, we saw each other for a couple hours for a Thai dinner. That was it. So I have no idea what's going on with those. But even where, for example, Steve's going to publish 2010 Bordeaux. That's one of the first, Napa. That's one of the first vintages I reviewed at the Advocate, and he'll have his own view, and maybe we'll agree, maybe we won't. The wines are tasted obviously at a distance of some years. You can compare Steve's 2010s today versus what he wrote years ago in the IWC. So, but we don't there's no quote unquote calibration. It's every person writes what they think. There's another really cool question that I think is good for all of us. Start with you, Eric. Is there a wine that has particularly impressed you in the last couple of years, that where like a producer has just really distinguished themselves with something that's just really grabbed you, something new and notable that you hadn't tasted before? That question's from Matt.
New and notable, haven't tasted before. I would say that if anything, I mean, it's not really new and notable, but I have become over the last few years a very big fan of the wines of Palo Bea, Sagrantino, and the Rosso from this producer, the multiple Rossos that this producer makes. You know, when people think about Italian wine, they automatically gravitate toward, and like the great producers, they gravitate toward Piedmont, they gravitate toward Tuscany, and not so many are looking at Umbria. But you know, right in this part of central Italy, we have some really big icon producers. In the last few years, I had been buying these wines, and I had been putting them away. But as many people know, Sagrantino has those really big, grippy tannins in their youth, and so I would put them away and I would kind of forget about them. And then a few years ago, I started finally pulling those wines out of storage and checking back in on them and writing some tasting notes and really finding some just really incredible experiences, specifically from Palo Bea, and also some amazing values that come from this producer. And it's just amazing to think how it's, you know, he's still, the producer's still so under the radar for the majority of collectors. You know, a lot of that is that they don't submit wines for samples, and so there's not a lot of people writing about them out there in the media for years. It's only if, you know, like if you were to acquire them on your own and such, as I did, it's the only time people are really seeing them. But certainly, you know, talk about icons. You know, Palo Bea is something that's like now every year, if I get an allocation, I'm taking it.
Cool. Steve, anything that's new and notable?
I think, you know, I've been in recent years visiting mostly Burgundy, California, and Washington State, and I think probably I see a few new people each year in Burgundy, Washington State too. I can't think offhand. I think Washington, in terms of a region, is really on the move each year. The wines have a little bit more class. People have figured out how to top up their barrels. There's more people drinking old world wines, and therefore trying to make wines with more restraint. I think, you know, Burgundy is not at a point right now, other than generational change, to me, that you see great changes. The wines are too easy to sell, first of all. So I'm sure, Antonio, you've probably seen more of those because you've made particular efforts on specific trips to see just new domains. And, you know, the question is, you could say the same thing in Chablis. There's a lot of really talented winemakers that only own village wine. They don't own important appellations. You want them to, you wish they would. They would be the stars of the future. But, you know, it's a matter of their age and their holdings. Obviously, you've been seeing a lot of people like that need to be followed.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think the generational issue is a big one in the Rhone, Josh. When I read your last article, I was surprised how many sort of like, oh, you know, so-and-so's daughter is now making the wines, or so-and-so's son is now making the wines, or, you know, it's amazing how much that region has really reinvented itself. What have you seen that's new and notable? Is it the Rhone? Else? Oregon?
Well, I'm thinking one particular producer in Oregon that I think deserves a lot of attention and is getting it pretty quickly is Kelly Fox, whose wines are absolutely gorgeous, just crystalline, pure, fabulous. She was the winemaker for Scott Paul for a long time, but now that she's out on her own, she's making absolutely stunning wines. Also in Oregon, same producer, but it seems like a gear here. He went into another gear, or a light switch went on, was Doug Tennell at Brickhouse. His most recent vintages are absolutely, I mean, gorgeous wines. And again, very pure, very fresh. He's always made good wines, but something happened there, and it wasn't generational. I guess it was generational in his head. I would say in Co-Roti, you have Bernard Levay, who was a familiar producer for me for many years. I used to sell the wines also used to sell Bea. And yes, his daughter took over, and the wines are still very much as they were, but there is this extra element of energy and freshness to the wines. So there's a generational thing. I think also sticking to Co-Roti at Geran, you have two brothers, Alexis and Mikel, taking over. And at Clouseau Roque, Guillaume Clouseau, the wines have definitely gone to another level. And you also see it even at René Rostaing, because his son Pierre has taken over. And the wines have just a greater consistency, to me, a greater purity. I mean, you can kind of go all over these regions and see this. And so for me, it's always exciting to see what the next generations bring. And actually, the one that really hit me the most was still in Co-Roti at Christophe Bonfond. His daughter, Leah, who I believe is 22 years old, finished viticultural school. I think she was in Macon, but she did a stage at Gonon down in Saint Joseph. And I think most people know those wines, and also worked overseas. Anyway, from the 2019 vintage, he let her make 5 barrels of her own wine, which is a blend of Rochin and Côte Rosier, which is done with 100% whole clusters, which is the opposite of her father's work. And it was stunning to me that this was made by a 22-year-old as a freshman effort. I mean, it blew me away, and I had to be a little bit careful talking about how good it was, because I just tasted through 3 vintages of her father's wines, and it was this completely opposite thing. And I mean, I could tell he was very proud of it, but at the same time, he was clearly thinking like, what the hell is she doing? So those kind of things I think are really exciting and make the whole thing a lot of fun.
I think those of us that tasted with the father for years and years and years, in so many cases, I would learn, oh, by the way, my wines have actually been made by my son or by my daughter for the last 7 or 8 years,
Right.
but I've never seen them. I've never been introduced.
Neil, what's new and notable for you?
I think just coming back to Burgundy, I do think the places like Mâconnais and Côte Chalonnaise are as the Côte d'Or just becomes more and more expensive, you know, that young talent can't afford. I mean, if on the rare occasions they can take over from their parents, great, but often that's just not the case. They've got to move out and find somewhere cheaper to farm, you know. So I think Côte Chalonnaise and Mâconnais is interesting, but for me, as I've written many times, I think the most exciting area for me is South Africa, because there's always been so much sort of prejudice against the country, including myself. When I started out, it was South Africa was always the butt of jokes, and 15, 20 years ago. But now I remember when I was tasting last year, and I was tasting through the whites, and I just said, I can't believe how good these wines are, and that they're retailing for like often $25, $30 in the US. And the quality, you know, I taste a lot of white Burgundy, and the quality is really sort of just amazing value. And it's an incredible country with a lot of challenges that other countries don't have. But I think that makes people like, I don't know, Chris Alheit and a lot of Schwartland producers, and in Hemelanade as well, really push that a little bit harder. So I'm always sort of championing sort of South Africa, but especially maybe the whites more than the reds for me personally. I think it's just a really exciting category. And every time I go back, there's something new.
Yeah, well, I think that's very true of every region that I cover and that I read articles of from you guys. It's just unbelievable. It could be Santa Barbara, it could be Chianti Classico, it could be Piedmont, it could be Napa Valley. There's new and notable in every one of those regions every single year, which is incredibly exhilarating, but also really demanding and challenging in terms of keeping up. If there's one area that I think really stands out recently, it's Alto Piemonte. And we just did an article on that recently. And I mean, I love getting criticism and feedback, and people are like, oh, you should taste this producer or that producer. And, when I first wrote about these wines 15 years ago, nobody cared at all. And now people care a lot. And that's fantastic because, one of the questions that we could spend an hour on is about climate change. But some of these regions in Burgundy, Steve, the ones that I like to go to, like Marange or whatever, you can make good wine there because you've got younger producers, better farming, and also more favorable climate than, let's say, a generation ago. That's also true in Alto Piemonte. It's true of a lot of regions around the world. And that's what I would say is new and notable, because there, the wines aren't just good, but that's a region where not just Alto Piemonte, but also the Nebbiolos of Valtellina, where the ceiling is world-class. It's not just that the wines are good, but they have the potential to really be next to the great one, what most people would describe as the benchmarks globally, and that's really exciting. So we're almost up against our time, but one of the questions I get asked a lot is, why are so many people in wine into music? I have no idea. Who wants to answer that?
I can answer that.
Yes, good.
Okay, this is my theory. Wine, you have to use 4 of your 5 senses.
Okay.
The only sense that you don't use with wine is hearing, unless you're sort of putting your ear to a fermenting barrel. And so I think music comes in and fills that sort of 5th sense. And I think there's lots of parallels between sort of music appreciation and wine appreciation. So that's just my theory.
Okay.
Cool.
Anybody else have a theory? That had never even occurred to me.
Well, certainly the more you learn, the more complex the subject becomes. I mean, talking about into the rabbit hole. I mean, I also studied piano when I was 7 and 8 and 9 years old, and I think I gave it up at that point for tennis. But I love bringing my soundtrack with me, by the way, on the road to group tastings, whether it's Spotify, usually jazz or classical music. Nothing very disturbing, but
okay,
it fills in a lot of space.
Yeah. Anybody else want to answer that? Anybody else have a view?
Yeah, I grew up around a lot of music. We didn't have a television at the behest of my mother, who was a pianist. Her mother was also a pianist, and her father was a saxophone player. They paid their way through college back in the 1920s, actually playing in their respective college bands at Carleton and University of Minnesota. And so for me, music was always there. That was the sort of the entertainment, I guess. And I find, especially at home writing, it, depending upon what you're listening to, it, in a way, it's a good distraction. I think it keeps your mind active. And I also think if you listen to at least what you consider to be really good music, there is a lot of complexity there. I mean, really good songs, you can listen to them maybe not over and over and over, but you always hear different things, or you focus on different things. And I think that helps the way that you maybe write about a wine or think about a wine, or even when you're tasting wine. I find that they go extremely well together. And for me, there's almost always music on.
But wines are like that too, aren't they? That the more you like great wine, you can come back to it, and you find a different layer, a different nuance, a different dimension.
Oh yeah, and I also think it's sort of funny if people say one of the most embarrassing things. I mean, most embarrassing thing probably is looking at your high school yearbook picture. The other one that's really bad is going back through your high school record collection, and you say, "Oh my God, I can't believe I listened to that." But also, digging out some of the old stuff and listening to it and trying to think, okay, why did I like that before? Or even finding things like the old thing with B-sides on 45s. Sometimes it was the B-side that was the most interesting, because often the artist would insist on that. That was their favorite song, where the powers that be said, this is going to be the hit, this is going to be the single. And the compromise was, well, let me put this one on the B-side. And so I also grew up learning that when you bought a 45, if anybody remembers those, the first thing you did was you played the B-side.
I've got them all behind me, Josh. If I move just twist it around here. So this is, I'm sitting where I write. And so that's some of my vinyl collection back there. And just the ritual is, you just put on a vinyl record, never Spotify these days, and then start writing away.
Yeah, music and wine are both a life force. And they're also both very social activities, I think.
For sure.
I see a huge connection between, there's that nostalgia factor the two things that trigger nostalgia the most for me are, aromas of foods and wines, as well as music. But also, I think that from the the wine writer versus music lover perspective, it's also the detail oriented person. It's that person that really wants to focus intensely on that one thing, that song, to understand it, to understand every small piece of it, to let that emotion envelop them. I find myself very much the same way approaching a glass of wine, where I want to understand those details. I want to dig in and sit with the glass. I'm also that person that gets a little upset when people start having conversations in the middle of a great song. At the same token, I want to put the glass to my nose and spend an entire minute taking it in. So I think there's a lot of similarities in the enjoyment of both.
For sure. And I think that's a great way to wrap things up. I want to thank everybody for watching, and thanks for your questions. It's such a privilege to work with such a great team of people. You inspire me every time I read your articles or talk to you. So thanks, guys. Thanks for the questions, and we'll see you on the next Vinous Live. Ciao. Have a great
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.